All right. Hi, everybody, and welcome to our webinar when AI becomes an insider threat, escalating privileges in AWS. I'm James Casagrande. I'll be your moderator today from Sunry Security. Today is really centered around the IAM security aspect of infrastructure service, AI infrastructure services in AWS, why it's important, and some new things that research has revealed around privilege escalation, credential exfiltration, etc., that we think are super interesting to discuss. Again, I'm from Sunry Security. If you don't know about Sunry, we are all about total control of permissions in your cloud. We built something called the Cloud Permissions Firewall. We'll discuss about a little bit about that later, but really for now, the meat of today's session is two scenarios in AWS that are new privilege escalation paths or associated new privilege escalation paths that you need to know about. And we'll sort of take it from both ends. There's going to be an agent side of things, securing agents within AWS, and then securing the agent creating infrastructure side of things, like Bedrock and some other services, brand new services we're going to talk about, both under the Bedrock umbrella and then also outside of it. Then we'll talk about recommended remediation and policy templates, probably some SCPs in there, and we'll have a little Q&A at the end. So please ask questions. This is meant to be interactive. And to get something out of the session, you'll probably need a basic working proficiency with AWS IAM and the console, but it's okay if you don't know something, just ask. That's why we're here. We're sort of trying to cater to all kinds of skill levels, but we will be showing the console, a little bit of Cloud Shell, and what have you. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking because I want you to really hear from our main speakers. The first man up top with the lovely smile and that naturalistic background that's somewhere probably in the Colorado wilds is Christophe Limpelaere. Christophe runs Cyber, CYBR, and has helped thousands of people get trained up on AWS skills, has a bunch of awesome courses on his site that we'll talk about later. Anyway, good morning, Christophe.
Morning. Oh, hey, good morning. Thanks for having me today. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining as always. And next is my colleague, Nigel Sood. Nigel is Sunry's researcher extraordinaire. Nigel's research into these new AI services in AWS is sort of what spurred this conversation that led to this session. He's looking into everything around Bedrock and finding fun new stuff, working with AWS to make sure all our documentation's up to date, making sure we are aware of any new threats on the related to IAM or privileges. But anyway, good morning, Nigel.
Hey, James, great to be here. Glad to finally get to blab about all the stuff that I've been digging into these past couple of months.
Absolutely. All right, so I'm going to disappear here because three's a crowd. But Nigel, to set the scene, let's take us into sort of the two different scenarios we're going to look at today, and sort of the broad strokes of how to what we're talking about securing from either end, from the agent end or the infrastructure side.
Yeah, of course. So when we're looking at AI in AWS, there's a whole bunch of services. We're going to be talking mainly about Bedrock today. But there's a whole bunch of AI services in AWS that you might use for a variety of reasons. But typically, you're going to want it to access some sort of other AWS resource. If you didn't need that, you'd probably be using API keys to foundation models or something like that. But if you need to access other resources, you're going to use the AI services in AWS for this. And intuitively, they're going to need to have some sort of identity and access management permissions. If you need to touch other things, identity and access management is the fabric of communicating with other AWS resources. So when you start spinning up these AI resources and you're starting to give them permissions, a lot of questions start to arise on how those permissions can be used. And so there's kind of two different ways that you can look at securing AI resources from a privilege perspective and potential ways that they can be abused from a privilege perspective. And we're going to look at both of those angles today. So the first bit is kind of securing access of AI resources. So making sure that the privileges that we're giving to the machine learning or AI workloads are being secured, so that they can't be coerced into doing anything you don't want them to do, but also securing access to those resources, making sure that people can't come in and go modify your agent definitions or go and give them access to new roles or modify any of the tooling that they have access to. And we're going to be doing some short demos from either side of this. I'm going to talk a little bit about Bedrock agents and how you can coerce them into doing stuff. And Christoph, I think you're going to take us on a bit of a deeper demo later on with Agent Core. But we'll switch over to the Bedrock console in AWS and kind of jump into our first demo here. And I will pull up my screen. All right, so I hope everybody can see this. I've got myself open in an AWS console right now. You'll probably see the VPC screen right now, and you can see that we've got one thing up in our account right now. This isn't going to be super relevant for now, but just knowing that there's one here will be important. We'll come back to it later. But I'm going to go and assume my Bedrock role. Oh, we'll get back in here. So I've got myself a Bedrock dev role. I've got Bedrock star, Bedrock agent core star, and not a whole lot else. You'll notice if I open this up and I try and do something in S3, it's not going to work. I try to list my buckets. I don't have the permissions. What I do have access to is all the stuff in Bedrock, and we're going to see if I can leverage some of the models that already exist in here to go and do some crazy things. We'll close out this. We'll take a look at the agents that we've got in this account. We can see that we've got this agent called My Health Bedrock agent. So we've got an agent here. This agent has been configured to be able to access a whole bunch of S3 stuff. Usually the way you would do this, if you wanted to do things securely in Bedrock, is that you would go and take all the S3 documents that you want to give your agents access to, wrap them up in a knowledge base, and give your agent access to that. Here, we wanted to do things quick and dirty. When Bedrock first came out, we stood up this agent and we decided, you know what, we just need to give it quick and dirty access to S3. We're going to give it S3 control plane access. So what I can do with this now is, even though, in Cloud Shell, I tried to list the S3 buckets using my agent core dev role, I wasn't able to do that. We'll start talking to the agent, and maybe I can start to get it to do some stuff for me. So I'll ask it something along the lines of, can you tell me what buckets are in my account? And we'll see if this works. And so whenever you have these agents that have some sort of agent execution role or access to tooling that has an execution role, you run into situations where maybe just by virtue of asking the agent questions, it can leverage those permissions to do things that the caller can't. And so here, even though I didn't have the permission to list buckets in S3, my permissions to invoke this agent has kind of escalated into that. And where we're talking about control plane access here, where we're going through the S3 CLI or the S3 control plane rather than through knowledge bases, as soon as you start talking about the control plane, you start to run into questions about, well, what permissions does the agent and does the execution role actually have? Because if we're talking about control plane, well, there are other services as well. And in this case, when I open up the console, I've shown that we only had one VPC in there. We're going to try something here. It will hopefully work. We'll see if it can do some other more sensitive, not just read-only stuff.
That's the fun part with live demos when you're dealing with AI agents. You never know if it's actually going to work the same way.
Yeah. So we'll see if it can create me a VPC. And just to prove that this is something I can't do myself, I'll open up Cloud Shell and give it a go. Oh, typo there. So yeah, you can see that I don't have permission to do this. But if I go and ask the agent to do it, it's thinking about it. And the neat thing is I don't even have permission to list VPCs with this identity. You'll notice that it tells me it created a VPC called GiggleNet VPC with a whole bunch of stuff. If I go over and try to confirm that, I'm not even going to be able to see it. But if I back out and go back to my administrator access role, we can go take a look and see if that actually worked or not. So beforehand, we only had the default VPC. You can see that we have that new one now. So the whole purpose of this was just to demonstrate that when you're moving quick and dirty with Bedrock agents and you're starting to give them access to permissions, if you don't lock down the way in which it can use those permissions, and here it was just through direct control plane access, then any additional permissions, here talking about EC2 create VPC, any permissions that the agent doesn't really need in order to perform its job. Maybe it only needs access to S3 buckets, but the execution role has more than that. If you're not controlling how the agent can use those permissions, then anybody who can talk to the agent can coerce it into using those permissions in a potentially very destructive way. You know, this could have been any other permission as well. It could have been delete VPC, and all of a sudden I'm tearing down critical infrastructure. So any permissions that your agents have and can actually use can be leveraged by anybody with permission to invoke that agent. So you've kind of created this pivot point where the moment you can talk to privileged AI resources and ask them to do stuff for you, all of a sudden that privilege is now open to you. So this was, really quick. I'm not going to go down too far into the weeds about how all the permission assignment actually worked, but it's just kind of a proof of concept that these agents do have privilege and can use privilege in your cloud, and you need to be careful about what they can do. So I'll stop sharing and I will pass it off to Christoph, unless you have anything you'd like to add.
No, that's a great demo. And part of what you demonstrated too with access to Amazon S3, I'm going to kind of piggyback off of that and show a different way of how you could also access resources when you're using a separate part of Bedrock called Agent Core and Code Interpreter. So I'll kind of dive more into that. But it's I'm going to be repeating part of that demo on purpose so that we can see what that looks like using Agent Core Code Interpreter. So yeah, let me go ahead and share my screen here, and I'll ask you to confirm if you're able to see it or not.
Yeah, we are live.
Okay, perfect. Also, let me make sure that my session did not expire, because that always happens every time I start screen sharing. I immediately get kicked out. So, okay, looks like we're good to go. I might get kicked out at some point during the demo. We'll see. But yeah, so kind of piggybacking off of what Nigel was demonstrating there. And we can also talk a little bit more about this towards the end if there's questions between, what's Bedrock compared to Agent Core, when should you use strands and things like that. But as a separate offering within Bedrock that's actually a little bit newer, looking at using something called Agent Core, we can see here that there's a lot of functionality within Agent Core that we can use to enhance our agents and give them access to tools. And they even call this feature here built-in tools, where we have something called Code Interpreter and then browser use. We're not going to be looking at browser use today. We'll be focusing on Code Interpreter. But if we head over to Bedrock Agent Core within the console, and then we go to build and deploy and switch over to built-in tools, this is what we'll be focusing on today. So let me zoom out just a little bit so you can see what I'm talking about. When you navigate over to this section here, you can see that by default, AWS already launches an AWS Managed Code Interpreter. That's right here. So all accounts that have access to this, if you go in this part of the console, you would see the AWS Managed Code Interpreter, just called Agent Core Code Interpreter. And then within that, you can also take a look at example codes of how you could call this via the Boto 3 SDK, or even if you'd prefer using TypeScript, you can also use that SDK as well. And you can kind of see how you can start or have your agent start interacting with Code Interpreter. And essentially what Code Interpreter gives us access to is creating sessions that we can then run arbitrary code within. So we can run the commands that would mimic what you'd be able to run via the AWS CLI, for example, but within that Code Interpreter session. And the reason I bring that up is because we can actually leverage this, just like what Nigel was showing before. We can leverage this to gain access to things that we wouldn't otherwise have access to, a classic privilege escalation attack. So this is pretty much where the console part of my demonstration ends. Although I say that, I'm going to be pulling up Cloud Shell, so technically still the console, but we'll pretend like we're doing this from the CLI, because there's actually not that much support within the console for Code Interpreter yet. I don't know if that's going to change in the future. This is a pretty new feature for AWS or /service. And so we'll probably see some changes here, but for the time being, a lot of this is really only doable through the API, CLI, etc. So what I'll do is I'll switch tabs over to the Cloud Shell, and then we'll get started. First of all, I will show you that I don't have access to S3, just like Nigel did previously, excuse me. And then I'll show you how I'm able to access some files that I should not have access to. So let me make this a little bit bigger. That should be okay, actually. Okay, so I'm just authenticated as a user. This user is just called Agent Core Attacker to make it a little bit easier. And we'll just do AWS S3 LS. Same thing there. I don't have access to anything S3 related in this account. I'm not able to list any of my buckets. I can't see anything within S3. But what I do have permissions for is creating these code interpreter sessions and then executing them, running code within those sessions. So this could mimic a variety of different scenarios, but maybe as an example, right, we might be a developer, and so our security team or another team ended up setting up some permissions for our code interpreter sessions, but they gave us the access to create those and inherit permissions as a result of that. So that's basically what I'll be demonstrating here in the session is getting started with that. All right, now that we've proven that we don't have access to S3, let's see if we can get access to S3. I'm going to be copying and pasting a few commands here so that we're not spending the whole session just fixing my typos. But essentially, just to show you, this environment's been pre-configured with a role already. So that kind of mimics what I was talking about before, where maybe like the security team or whatever team you have at your organization that's in charge of creating these roles for the dev team, they've already pre-created a role called Agent Core Interpreter. So we'll just retrieve it to show that. And so we can see that this role does exist. And then next, we can just retrieve policies that are attached to that role. And so that way we can see what we would be able to escalate our privileges to. So in this case, that team that set up this role used the Amazon or AWS managed policy of Amazon S3 full access. So if I'm an attacker that stole these developers' credentials through phishing, malware, whatever, GitHub leaks or anything like that, and I now get into this account and I see this, and I know that I have access to create code interpreter sessions, now I can see that I'm able to potentially access all of the S3 information. So this immediately becomes interesting to me. But how do I go from this to actually executing that arbitrary code that I was talking about? Well, that's where you can go ahead and create a code interpreter session. And we will use this command right here for that. So I'll kind of, I'll walk through it, then we'll execute it, and then we'll backtrack a little bit. So what I'll issue is a command called Bedrock Agent Core Control. Here we'll create our custom code interpreter, and within that we can create our sessions. We'll do that within the US East 1 region. We'll name this just custom agent interpreter, but you can name it whatever you want. And then we'll set a network configuration. And we'll talk a little bit more about this probably towards the end as well, but Nigel's research showed that this can apply regardless of whether you're using the public network mode or the private/sandbox network mode. Now, it does change the PrivEsc attack a little bit and what you're able to access. So when you set the network mode to public here, you do have access to essentially the open internet. And so, or whatever that role is able to give you, of course, can limit that ability. But essentially, that's a very broad network mode that you can set. But even if you set this to sandbox, you can still perform some of these attacks anyway. So we can talk about that a little bit more. I just wanted to mention that. And then, of course, I'm going to pass in my execution role ARN here, which is going to pass in that agent code interpreter role, which is the one that we just saw up here. So again, this just mimics somebody setting up that role for you that you can now use in order to create your custom code interpreter and then create sessions within that. So I'll go ahead and press enter and you'll see what I mean. All right, so now we've created this code interpreter. We get back a code interpreter ID. If I go back to the console just for a second and then back out of the AWS managed one and go to built-in tools, I don't even have to refresh, it's already there. This is the custom code interpreter that we just literally created that wasn't there just a few minutes ago. And then if we click within it, we can see that we can have sessions, but right now, of course, we haven't run anything yet, so we don't yet have that session. So what I'll do next is I'll actually set my interpreter, if I can spell that, interpreter. I don't know why I have a hard time with that word. I'll set my interpreter ID equals to what we just created, just as an environment variable, so I can access that in the rest of my script here. So we will grab that script. And if you remember before, when I was showing this, come on. If you remember when I was showing this in the managed version of it, where we had that custom Python code that was using Boto3, that's all I'm doing here as well. I'm literally just going to use the Boto3 SDK so that my Python scripts can execute. So all I'm doing here is I'm just echoing into a Python file just so we can see what's going on. So this Python file is going to be called privescdemo.py. And it's going to contain the following. We're going to have import Boto3. We're going to set up our Bedrock Agent Core client. We're going to pass in that code interpreter ID that I saved before as my environment variable here. Hopefully I spelled that right. Yep, looks good. Then we're going to create a session within that code interpreter ID. We're going to grab a session ID, and then we're going to create a custom function called run command and print results, where we'll pass in that command via the code argument variable. So we will grab that response, we will stream that response back on the screen, and then we'll be able to see what the result of that command was. All this is doing is passing in what would otherwise be an AWS CLI command within that custom function. So if we want to do get caller identity via AWS STS via the CLI, then that's essentially mimicking that exact ability that I would have via the command line interface, but through the role used by that code interpreter session. So let's go ahead and press enter on this, clear out the screen a little bit, and then I'll execute this Python script and you'll be able to see what I mean, and then we'll expand it from there. So we'll run our privescdemo.py, and we will get back the result of AWS STS get caller identity. The reason I wanted to demo that first before we do the privesc is to show you that this indeed is using our assumed role of agent code interpreter role. So even though I'm authenticated as the agent core attacker user, I now have the ability to execute arbitrary code via this assumed role, which is exactly what we wanted to see, at least as an attacker, maybe not on the defensive side, but as the person performing the pen test or whatever, this is exactly what we would like to see. But now I want to start to enumerate information about this environment, and in particular about Amazon S3, since I know that that environment has, or excuse me, that role has access to Amazon S3. So what I can start doing as I'm going through my pen test or red team engagement is I can start adding more commands to this file. For example, can I list out all of my buckets within S3? Well, let's go ahead and find out. Let's add this line to the end of our script. Let's re-execute that script. Give it just a couple seconds. And yeah, just like that, I'm able to see all of the S3 buckets within this environment. And in particular, I'm cheating a little bit here because I set up this environment, but I know that this particular S3 bucket is going to be of interest. We have Bedrock Agent Core customer data. And so perhaps this agent was set up in order to perform analysis on actual customer data, right? And so it would need access to that S3 bucket that contains that customer data. So now maybe just to finalize this whole demo, maybe I can start to enumerate information contained within this bucket. So I could go ahead and add this line here, where we're again calling our custom function, but this time we're passing in the command of AWS S3ls, and we're particularly targeting this S3 bucket right here. So if I rerun it once more, you'll guess what happens next. We'll be able to see the contents of that S3 bucket. And of course, no, we cannot, because I copied and pasted the wrong ID in there. So let me fix that really quickly. So we've got 3962. Of course, it's going to fail because I've got the other command in there, and I don't care enough to remove it, but we'll see a failure, and then we should see the actual correct one. So there we go. So now we have customer data, and we could keep going, right? I can't leave it on a cliffhanger note. Let's go ahead and actually retrieve one of the files within there. And so I'll update the proper ID here. But you should get the idea by now, right? It's just I have to finish this. I have to see this to fruition. But just like Nigel was demoing before, just in a slightly different way of executing it, we are now able to escalate our privileges by working through the privileges that are part of this code interpreter. And here I can see the customer files or profiles.csv, financial transactions.csv, support tickets.json, and I'd be able to print out the contents of that document because, of course, this role needed to grant permissions to these files for our agent to be able to perform some sort of data analysis. So any questions on how this worked or how this was possible, and maybe how it differs compared to Nigel's presentation? Or Nigel, anything to add to that?
No, I think that was great. There's a couple of questions in the chat right now that it might be good to talk about. Somebody was asking how this is any different from EC2 executing using an instance profile or something like that. And I think that's a really good question. I can talk to it maybe a little bit, and then I'll pass it over if you have any other comments. But I think one of the big differences here with EC2, and we're actually going to talk about this a little bit later, are the things that you can do to prevent it. So with EC2, you can limit access to EC2 in a number of ways. You can stick it in a private VPC to make sure that nobody else is able to talk to it. You can lock down Instance Connect to make sure that people can't just go in. With something like a code interpreter or even agents, you can't really lock them down at the network level the same way that you can do with an EC2 instance. The access comes through identity and access management permissions. So if an identity gets compromised in your cloud and it has Bedrock permissions, there's potential that more damage could be done, because this is going to be easier to do with just a set of identity and access management permissions. And also, from a completely other side of things, Bedrock is still relatively new, and a lot of these risks aren't yet known. So even though we're still leveraging a compute with permissions in the same way that you could do with EC2, that risk has been around and it's been well known, and a lot of companies are doing a really good job at locking that sort of stuff right down. But the same sort of risks and how they appear in Bedrock, I haven't seen them talked about nearly as much. So I think that spreading awareness that these same types of risks that you do see with EC2, and you're right, it is pretty similar, they do exist here as well, and we're just trying to highlight that.
Yeah, perfect answer. I don't have anything to add to that. I was going to say it's basically the same thing, but just not really being talked about as much and not as well known. So I appreciate Nigel making this known to the world and putting a little bit of a spotlight on it, because people do need to know about it if they're going to be using Bedrock and in particular Agent Core.
Yeah. And I think was there anything else that you wanted to add about your demo, Christoph?
No, I was looking to see if there's any specific questions about it, but it looks like there's interest in knowing how to mitigate. So it's a good segue into that.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit about a few things you can do from the monitoring side, and also a few things you can do from the actual mitigation side. So for monitoring and detecting, particularly for the Bedrock Agent Core type stuff, you can monitor a certain degree using CloudTrail by default. There's a lot of management events in there that are really good. As part of your demo, you had talked about creating a code interpreter using a known identity and access management role, and then going and creating sessions and then leveraging the permissions associated with it. This is like one of many possible privilege escalation paths that abuse IAM pass role, where you're creating a resource with a role that you can give it to abuse the credentials of that role. And so leveraging or monitoring for the management events that leverage that IAM pass role permission in order to stand up resources with privilege is one thing that you can do to monitor and detect for this. And so the big one that would be relevant to the demo that you had just done is looking for that create code interpreter event in CloudTrail. If you see that and it's not by somebody who's actively toying around with Agent Core agents and trying to give them access to internal tooling, if you see that from anybody else, you know that you've got a potential privilege escalation attempt on your hands. And create code interpreter is one of those. There's plenty of other permissions as well in Bedrock and in Agent Core and in many of the other AI services that exist in AWS where you are passing roles to resources. And you want to be, restricting access to those permissions, but also looking out for when they're being used. If you can catch somebody when they're creating a code interpreter that they will then attempt to leverage, that's an early sign. Going a little bit further than that, if you're trying to monitor for the actual invocations of some of these tools, the invocations of Bedrock agents, the invocations of code interpreters and Agent Core, that gets a little bit trickier. That accesses the data plane more than it does the control plane. And so a lot of those events won't actually show up in CloudTrail by default. So one of our recommendations for monitoring, particularly for Bedrock and for Agent Core, is actually to enable data events if you can, afford to do so, because you can start to catch those instances where people are creating code interpreter sessions and creating code interpreter invocations to leverage existing infrastructure to leverage those permissions. with your demo, if there are already code interpreters created in an AWS environment, and we'll talk about why it's hard to lock these down later on. But if you've already got code interpreters with identity and access management permissions, it only takes 2 permissions to invoke it and ask it to do anything you want. You got to create the session and you need to invoke the code interpreter. And neither of those 2 events are actually monitored by default as a management event in CloudTrail. So enabling data events is kind of that second step to monitoring and detecting when somebody is leveraging these. And from the remediation side, we've got one sample SCP up here, but there's plenty of things that you can do. Obviously, you don't want anybody with fully administrative star permissions across the board, ever, but it does happen. And so one of the first things that you can do at the really, really top level is if in an account you're not using Agent Core, you're not using these AI services, you can just restrict the entire service as a whole in that account. And it reduces the amount of resource types that can be created to leverage this pass role type of privilege escalation. But at the next step down, if you do want to be playing with Bedrock and Bedrock Agent Core in your AWS accounts, one of the things that I would recommend is restricting Agent Core code interpreter access to the agents. So as a developer, maybe you need access to this for a short while to test to make sure that it's behaving as it should. But in Christoph's demo, we didn't actually touch agents in Agent Core whatsoever. We were just using the agent tooling. We talked a little bit earlier maybe about the differences between Bedrock and Bedrock Agent Core, but Agent Core is all about agent orchestration and infrastructure management, having your agent definitions separate from your tooling. And so your code interpreters are designed to be tools for your agents. Because they're accessed with identity and access management, anybody with the right permissions can go and access them. But if they're only really needed for your agents, you can use an SCP like this one to lock down access to your code interpreters to only your agents. So you would just need to go through and figure out exactly what identity and access management roles will need to be able to invoke that code interpreter. And that would just be the execution roles for all your agent runtimes in Bedrock Agent Core. And so you just go and add some conditions to make sure that those ones are still allowed, and then deny access to any custom code interpreter for any other identity. So it's a bit templated here. You'll go and have to figure out what some of those parameters are, but you'll need to do that. And once you get that in place, then anybody who wants to go and access privileged code interpreter roles is not going to be able to do that with developer roles or with administrator roles or anything else. So that's another thing you can do. We mentioned SCPs. Christoph, have you dug into this at all? Do you know why we're recommending SCPs specifically for Bedrock?
So I haven't dug into it too much, but I do know that from a practical perspective, it's actually quite limited in terms of what you can apply to this so far. Like you don't really have access to things like resource-based policies, RCPs, and things like that, but you do have access to SCPs. So I know that's something you touched on in your research as well of maybe not the best tool for this in particular, but it does actually help quite significantly, at least as a starting point. And hopefully then AWS starts to add more support as they go on with more of the resource-based approach.
Yeah, exactly. Bedrock and Bedrock Agent Core. Bedrock Agent Core particularly is still in preview mode. And right now, there is no support for resource policies whatsoever across the board for any resource that you can create in Agent Core. And I think it's still the same in Bedrock. So if you want to restrict access to specific resources in Bedrock or in Agent Core, you actually have to do it through SCPs. And so you can use templated stuff like this to go and restrict access to specific resources to only the identities that need it. And, you can go and do least privilege right this way. But it's actually rather difficult because the SCPs you need to configure in the org management account. It's only usable if you're using AWS organizations. So, the developers who are creating these code interpreters are going to know what agent runtimes and Agent Core actually need to have access to them. They can't go and create the policies to go and restrict that access like you normally would with a resource policy. They actually have to go and pass that off to somebody who has access to the org management account to go and create the SCP statements and then apply it at the account level or the OU level or whatever it may be. So there's a little bit more of a headache when it comes to applying controls through SCPs. So I'm hopeful that as Agent Core moves out of preview mode, we start to get access to RCPs, not RCPs, resource policies. And somebody had asked earlier about the difference between EC2 and this. And, there's plenty of other services too, where you've got computes with access to permissions. It's the same with Lambda. It's the same with ECS. It's the same with a bunch of other stuff. But a lot of those services, I'm thinking Lambda in particular, you can stick resource policies in front of it. If you want to invoke a Lambda function, there's a way that you can stick a permissions policy in front of it to say, hey, only these identities can access and invoke this Lambda function. With Bedrock right now, there's no way to do that. So yeah, for a remediation perspective, kind of at the really high level, blocking access to entire AI services if you don't need them in that account. If you do, using more tailored SCP statements like this to restrict access to the specific privileged resources that you've got in your account.
And just to briefly add here, in case somebody's watching this maybe a couple months down the road as a replay, because it's currently in preview mode, a lot of this will probably change. So please double check what we're talking about here, because I would expect AWS to make some changes here for sure.
Absolutely.
Definitely. All right, thanks, guys. And yeah, towards that end, right, if you're looking to secure not only just the services we talked about today, but the IAM, control plane. That's what Sunray Security does. We have a cloud permissions firewall that is what we like to call a cloud PAM. So if you don't want to deal with SCPs or RCPs, or writing them, or having to figure out who has access to what service, or just having an off button for a service, just at some scope, at an account level, an OU or an org, Sunray Security's Cloud Permissions Firewall might be for you. So take a look. We have a 14-day free trial, and we handle a lot of privilege granting with just-in-time privileges on demand through Slack and Teams. So the idea is sort of to be really just developer-friendly, be able to, in situations like, hey, I have someone who wants to test Agent Core, right? Do it safely, have the right guardrails around it from an IAM perspective. Because as we can see, right, and I think everybody knows who works on AWS, there's cool new stuff and that we security vendors like to get excited about around LLM security and model level security, but it's really important to just first secure the infrastructure. And the easiest way to do that is by securing it at the IAM layer. So talk to us if you want to do more there. And of course, the greatest thing you could do is actually just know more. And if you went through today and said, hey, that was great, but that's a whirlwind and I want to go deeper, that's where Christoph and Cyber come in. Christoph has a ton of courses available, both on adjacent to this topic and also for a ton of AWS infrastructure sort of topics. Christoph, anything you want to highlight from Cyber these days?
Yeah, I appreciate the shout out. I was aiming to have a hands-on lab that demonstrates what we walked through here today. It's not quite ready yet. Give me a few more days, and hopefully by the end of this week, if not next week, I'll have that hands-on lab ready as well. So if you want to repeat this in a sandbox environment that you don't have to worry about, definitely check us out at Cyber. We have a lot of labs like this, and we're starting to add more of the AI type of tooling labs as well. So definitely check us out.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so we've answered a few questions so far. If you have more, please fire them in. If we don't get to them today, we obviously will answer them later. I want to make sure we got to, so we had the question about EC2. We also had a question, guys, about during Christoph's demo about the S3, if it's configured with Bedrock. And well, I don't know if we addressed that one, if you guys can see that one. If not, do we want to cover it, or is it something we've already sort of gone over?
Let me take a look here. So they're saying it means if S3 is fully permissioned, but if configured with AWS Bedrock, then there is privilege escalation. What exactly is the misconfig there in Bedrock? Is it problem with Bedrock policy used in S3? So just to clarify, this does not just apply to Amazon S3. And Nigel, maybe we can briefly talk about sandbox mode here for a second. I know that's something we'll probably end up looking at more, maybe another session, but so like this demo we just did here today, as Nigel's demo demonstrated as well, by the way, is it can also impact other things like VPC, EC2, secrets manager, basically anything where, at least on my side of the demo, if the agent needs access to a particular service through its tooling. Maybe it needs access to something in Secrets Manager or to another type of database, to some other API or server. Like anything like that could be impacted. It doesn't just have to do with Amazon S3. Just kind of chose S3 as a good demo here. But yeah, it's definitely not just restricted to that. And then maybe we can answer the second part of the question that they had there.
Yeah. So S3 was just kind of the example here for showing that permissions can be leveraged from inside the machine. But S3 is actually a really interesting case, and you mentioned the different modes of the code interpreters. In the example that you went through, you were using a public mode code interpreter, and what that meant is that the code interpreter had access to the internet. It can go and access those regional endpoints. It can go and leverage those permissions by pinging the control plane for any service through whatever regional endpoint that it needs to. When you sandbox a code interpreter, when you go and take away some of that network access, it still has the permissions and it can still leverage some of them. And S3 is actually one of the special cases where from inside the code interpreter, it can actually still leverage those permissions. So if we had done that demo again, but instead of public, you would replace that with the sandbox mode code interpreter, that S3 portion of the demo would still work 100%. Now, if you tried to do something else, if you tried to access the AWS STS endpoint, you tried to go and create a new VPC, tried to use any of those regional service endpoints, it's not going to work because it doesn't have internet access. But because those permissions are still configured within the code interpreter to be able to access S3, those permissions can still be exfiltrated. And there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. It's a little bit more complicated than just passing AWS CLI commands, but you can go and grab the role session credentials from that code interpreter, and if you can get those role credentials returned to you, you can go and just configure those locally, and on your local machine that has internet access, now you can start to use those permissions. So talking about the network mode of the code interpreter, you might think that sandboxing it to restrict internet access will help you secure the abuse of those permissions. If you've got a determined attacker who can directly ping the code interpreter, it doesn't really help you all that much.
And then just to clarify, since there was a follow-up comment about that saying, it's all about an agent core problem, and it's not. It's not just about agent core. As we saw also in the first part of the demo, it also involves just Bedrock in general. Basically anything where you could give an AI agent access to permissions that the person calling it, or the identity calling it, I should say, doesn't have access to those things, you have the potential for that problem. So not necessarily just an agent core problem, just to clarify there.
Yeah, absolutely. This is kind of an iteration on the classic, you have a compute with permissions, and anybody who can tell that compute what to do can leverage those permissions. This is the same thing as that, but now you've got an extra layer of abstraction where you might be talking to agents and you might have to find the right words to tell it to do what you want it to do, but you still, at the end of the day, have an identity in the cloud that you can talk to. And if you can get it to do what you want it to do, all of a sudden those permissions are yours. And so any of those invocation permissions to talk to agents, even to talk to the agent tooling like code interpreters, all of a sudden those permissions become super sensitive and super privileged from an identity and access management perspective, because that's how you pivot into a new role.
And then we had one more question about how to identify through data events whether agent core is compromised. Can we talk a little bit about some of the key indicators that we could see in CloudTrail when we enable data events that otherwise may not be there?
Yeah, so you'll see a couple of additional data events that are going to show up when people start to try to talk to these resources. So if you were to go through and take a look at CloudTrail for the demo that Christoph had done earlier, you're not going to see the session creation or the code interpreter invocation logs for when the session was created and when we were passing those AWS CLI commands. If you turn data events on, you're going to start to see those events, and they're going to be attached to the identity who is performing the right Boto3 API actions. And so that code interpreter attacker role, you're going to see attached to code interpreter session creation and code interpreter invocation. And you'll know right away that if that identity is not tied to an agent runtime and it's not tied to someone that you know is doing development for Bedrock Agent Core, then there's potentially some funny business going on. So those are the two that I would look at from the code interpreter demo, is look for session creation and look for code interpreter invocation from unexpected identities.
All right. I think that's all the questions we had. Thank you guys so much for all that detail. Really appreciate it. For everybody listening, we'll definitely, Christoph, when that lab is ready, we will definitely send that out to everyone who
Awesome.
registered for this. We'll also send you just a recording and the slides as well. This is the contact info for these two guys here. Like I said, if you work in AWS, if you're securing, either test with securing people, building a bunch of agents, or you're trying to run Bedrock yourself, these are two people you should know. So reach out and connect to them. Please ask us questions. They're not to volunteer them to sign up, but they're generous with their time and their expertise. So please reach out. That's it for us. Thank you very much, Christoph. Thanks a bunch for jumping on with us here at Sunray Security.
Thank you.
And there's more to come here. Christoph's doing labs. Nigel's snooping around on the any new sort of permissions that are coming out from AWS. So I'm sure he'll find more. And yeah, we will see you guys next time.